Hello, this video is brought to you by the Speak Out organization, which is a youth initiative dedicated to promoting public speaking and civic engagement. Today we're doing a topic analysis of the 2023 September-October LD topic, which is resolved. The United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. First, let's get into some background information. There have been several international and domestic proposals for the right to housing. The UN's Declaration of Human Rights recognizes housing, or more specifically adequate housing, as a human right. Furthermore, the Housing is a Human Rights Act was introduced in the U.S. more recently to dedicate funds and services to addressing gaps in housing, specifically to decrease homelessness. And there have also been other countries who have established legislation that essentially guarantees the right to housing. Two of the main countries to do this have been Scotland and South Africa, and they have since seen their homeless population dramatically decrease. Now some definitions. Guarantee is defined by Oxford Languages as provide a formal assurance or promise, especially that certain conditions shall be fulfilled relating to a product, service, or transaction. What that means is to fulfill a promise or commitment made. The right to housing is typically defined as adequate housing, which includes security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy, according to the OHCHR. Ought is defined as what is morally right to do by Collins Dictionary, which we can derive a moral obligation from. And finally, United States is widely interpreted as the federal government. However, some states' counterplans might defend it as the state's governments. It just depends on the argument you are running. Okay, on to AF framework. There's a few ways to go about this. Some values include but are not limited to justice, which is basically equality for all, morality, which is doing what is morally right, cont, which is acting rationally in accordance with a universal moral law, and international law, which is adhering to laws established internationally. There are obviously other values you can use, however, these are what I think will be the most commonly used throughout these 2 months. Value criterions would be minimizing structural violence, which is decreasing the harm people receive from social structures or institutions, particularly marginalized communities, maximizing well-being, which can be defined in different ways, including the greatest good for the greatest number, or increasing pleasure and minimizing pain. There's also maximum of available resources, which is increasing the resources to make them accessible to anyone, i.e. housing. There is also veil of ignorance, which is impartial decision-making by making decisions as a non-biased member of society. Human rights, which is upholding human rights and making decisions to accomplish that. Harms reduction, which is very similar to maximizing well-being. And finally, consistency with international law, which is following rulings made by international organizations such as the UN, which has established housing as a human right. NEG framework is significantly more limited, however, there are still some pretty solid ways to go. First, we have libertarianism, which says that the most important right is the right to private property, which is the right that the government should prioritize under a libertarianism framework. You can also run Kant on NEG, and you can also run Hobbes, which talks about the social contract theory and comes to the conclusion that we must submit to the authority of an absolute power. So on the NEG, this would look like saying that we ought to follow the government's rulings and surrender moral judgment, which would be as it relates to the idea that we ought to guarantee the right to housing. And finally, you can use util because it would be useful for econ DAs and similar DAs to say those that way, because typically the econ DAs I've seen ran end with an extinction impact. Okay, now some common and strategic AF arguments you can run. First is addressing homelessness. This says that the government can create targeted policies and allocate resources to effectively combat homelessness. The impact is improved health, increased economic stability and opportunity, enhanced social cohesion, and reduced strain on healthcare systems. Economic stability and opportunity come from the fact that using the OHCHR's definition of the right to housing, it means that everyone has the right to be located near employment opportunities and education. For enhanced social cohesion, the argument could go that in the status quo there is a certain stigma against homeless people, and reducing homelessness combats that. Additionally, there is an increased strain on healthcare systems that comes from having to use taxpayer money to pay for healthcare and for homeless people, which could potentially be reduced by them having a house and being able to focus on actually potentially paying for healthcare. There are also specific advantages to subsets of the population, specifically marginalized groups. There is a bunch of literature out there about racialized homelessness, the right to housing for indigenous people, queer people, disabled people, etc. Second is the economic advantage of housing. The right to housing increases economic productivity by creating opportunities for people to live closer to employment and stimulates growth because people start to pay more taxes due to having more opportunities with the right to housing. The impact is economic growth, reduced poverty rates, and decreased reliance on public assistance programs. Third is educational opportunities. Similar to the econ advantage, the safety and adequacy that comes with housing means an increased ability to attend school stably, as stable housing reduces school transfers, absence from school, and disruptions in education. That means higher graduation rates, improved educational attainment, and a stronger workforce, which fits nicely with the econ advantage. Fourth is crime reduction. This argument basically goes that when people have secure housing, they are less likely to resort to criminal behaviors driven by desperation or lack of opportunities, and the impacts would be safety and reduced strain on law enforcement resources. Fifth is the disaster resilience advantage. So natural disasters disproportionately affect homeless individuals, displacing them and exacerbating housing instability, and the right to housing bolsters disaster resilience and increases protection from natural disasters. Sixth is gentrification. So gentrification often leads to the displacement of low-income and marginalized communities from their neighborhoods. Gentrification can erase the cultural fabric and historical significance of a neighborhood. The impact is disrupted lives, increased poverty rates, and weakened social bonds within the community, all because of gentrification. That it also leads to escalating homelessness rates, increased housing insecurity, and a lack of economic diversity in the community. The right to housing solves this because if everyone is guaranteed housing, landlords probably have more restrictions on what they can and can't do in terms of eviction and displacement, and even so, people still have the right to adequate housing in an adequate area with opportunities by guaranteeing the right to housing. So at the least, the impacts of gentrification are mitigated. Seventh is domestic violence. This is a really strategic argument to run because there is a bunch of literature on how the threat of homelessness impedes domestic violence victims from escaping harmful living spaces. On top of this, these victims are then disproportionately denied housing precisely because they are a victim of domestic violence, which makes the problem even worse. That leads to staying with abusers, which leads to decreases in mental and physical health, trauma, suffering, and studies even show an increase of death because of staying with an abuser. Now for some negative arguments. Again, these are significantly more limited than arguments, but we did our best to provide you with a few different strategic arguments you can feel comfortable running. The first is government overreach, which is best paired with a libertarianism framework. This says that expanding government involvement in housing could lead to excessive regulations and bureaucracy. This government intervention might limit private property rights and hinder market-driven solutions, stifling innovation and creating inefficiencies in housing allocation. The impact of not guaranteeing the right to housing is protection of individual autonomy, preservation of a competitive housing market, and a prevention of potential government overreach. The second negative argument is the econ disad. This is best read against a plan or where the AFS defends a specific type of implementation. The argument says that the cost of implementing a nationwide right to housing could strain public finances. Then there's a link chain where right to housing zeros investments, the housing market collapses, and it culminates in nuclear war. There's a few different versions, but most would end with an extinction impact. You could also take a different direction and say something like this, that implementing the right to housing would require significant financial resources, potentially leading to higher taxes, increased government debt, or diversion of funds from other essential services. The third negative argument is the rights bad argument, or the rights PIC. It can also be read as a sort of Agamben K. So there's four main arguments you might see in this sort of critique of rights. So first would be that legal rights-based systems are ineffective because they result in over-legalized social policies and make enforcement and realization of the rights nearly impossible. A second argument you might see under this is that rights require no implementation, follow-up, etc. Third would be that rights are a means of exclusion, and fourth, we would say that rights discourse furthers biopolitical governance, de-radicalizes movements, and all of this means that AF does nothing to solve the status quo's problems that it talks about. The fourth neg argument is the settler colonialism K. This can be run on pretty much any topic, and this one is no exception. Put in very simple terms, it says that the AF establishes the right to housing by building on indigenous land. It can further say that the alt solves the right to housing because indigenous communities did ensure housing. Our fifth and final neg argument for today is the state's counterplan. This says that instead of the federal government enforcing the right to housing, we should have the state governments do so. There are cards you can find that say states enforce it better because they are closer to the issue, etc. And this is good because it upholds federalism, and you can find all sorts of evidence on why federalism is good. I've also seen this run with a court clog DA, so if you're considering going this way, you might want to look into that. Alright, that concludes the end of our topic analysis for the September-October LD topic. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to put them in the comments below.